The Zodiac Killer, what the evidence proves and where the case stands today. One of the most well-known cold cases in history is the Zodiac Killer. Quite a few stories and exposés have been produced about this unknown killer. Here is what we know. Between December 1968 and October 1969, an unidentified attacker targeted 4 separate groups of people in California. 5 victims were killed. 2 survived. The attacker then began sending letters to newspapers, taking credit for the crimes, revealing details that had not been released to the public, and demanding that his messages be printed. He included strange symbols, threats, and coded messages. He gave himself a name that would become known throughout the world: the Zodiac. More than 55 years later, investigators still have not proved who he was. Numerous people have been proposed as suspects. Independent groups have repeatedly announced that they have solved the case. Books, documentaries, and online researchers have presented theories ranging from reasonable to completely unsupported. But no person has ever been convicted of the Zodiac murders. No law enforcement agency has officially declared the killer identified. Today, we are going to examine what is known, what remains uncertain, the most recent theories, and the evidence that may, or may not, eventually solve the case. Welcome to Cold Cases with Alan Key. I'm Alan Key, a former major crimes detective and current polygraph examiner. In this episode, I will not accuse anyone of being the Zodiac Killer. When I discuss a possible suspect, I will clearly separate documented evidence from allegations, opinions, and speculation. This story begins on a dark road outside Benicia, California, the Lake Herman Road murders. On the night of December 20th, 1968, 17-year-old David Faraday and 16-year-old Betty Lou Jensen were parked along Lake Herman Road. At some point, another vehicle apparently stopped nearby. The person inside approached the young couple and opened fire with a .22 caliber semi-automatic firearm. David was found near the passenger side of the vehicle. Betty Lou had attempted to run, but was shot several times and collapsed a short distance away. Both teenagers died. There was no clear motive. Investigators found no convincing evidence of robbery, a personal dispute, or a known connection between the victims and their attacker. Police collected cartridge cases and other physical evidence, interviewed people who had traveled through the area, and attempted to reconstruct the movements of vehicles seen that night. The investigation produced leads, but it did not identify the killer. At that point, no one was using the name Zodiac. The killings were initially investigated as an isolated double homicide. Blue Rock Springs. More than 6 months later, shortly after midnight on July 5, 1969, 22-year-old Darlene Farron and 19-year-old Michael Mageau were sitting inside a car at Blue Rock Springs Park in Vallejo, California. Another vehicle entered the parking area, left, and then returned. A man approached the passenger side of Darlene's car. He directed a flashlight toward the occupants and began firing a 9mm handgun. The shooter initially walked away, but returned and fired additional rounds after hearing movement from inside the car. Darlene Farron was killed. Michael Mageau survived, despite suffering serious gunshot wounds. Shortly afterward, a man telephoned the Vallejo Police Department from a public telephone. He reported the shooting and also claimed responsibility for the Lake Herman Road murders. The caller provided information indicating knowledge of the crime. Investigators now had reason to believe the 2 attacks were connected. Mageau described the shooter as a white man with a heavy build, but the attack occurred at night. A flashlight had been directed into the vehicle, and Mageau had been severely wounded. His opportunity to observe the attacker was limited. Eyewitness descriptions are important, but they are not perfect recordings. Lighting, stress, injuries, and the passage of time can all affect identification. That limitation would become important when Mageau was later shown photographs of possible suspects.
The first letters and the 408 cipher. On July 31, 1969, 3 newspapers received letters from someone claiming responsibility for the Lake Herman Road and Blue Rock Springs attacks. The letters were sent to the San Francisco Chronicle, the San Francisco Examiner, and the Vallejo Times-Herald. Each envelope contained one section of a cipher. When the three sections were combined, the cryptogram contained 408 characters. The writer demanded that the newspapers publish the cipher and threatened additional violence if they refused. He also included crime details that helped investigators determine that the writer probably possessed direct knowledge of the attacks. Donald and Betty Harden, a Salinas area teacher and his wife, solved most of the cipher within days. The message described the writer's enjoyment of killing and his belief that his victims would serve him in an imagined afterlife. It did not disclose his identity. On August 4th, another letter arrived. This time, the writer opened with the words that would define the case. "This is the Zodiac speaking." The Zodiac persona had been created. The killer was no longer communicating only with police. He was using newspapers to speak to an entire population. The letters generated fear far beyond the locations where the actual attacks occurred. The attack at Lake Berryessa. On September 27, 1969, 20-year-old Brian Hartnell and 22-year-old Cecilia Shepard were relaxing beside Lake Berryessa in Napa County. A man approached wearing a dark hood over his head. On the front of the hood was the crossed circle symbol that had appeared in the Zodiac correspondence. The man carried what appeared to be a firearm and told Hartnell and Shepard a story about being an escaped prisoner. He ordered Cecilia to bind Brian's hands. He then tightened the bindings and restrained Cecilia. The attacker stabbed both victims repeatedly. After leaving them, he wrote on the door of Hartnell's vehicle. The writing included the dates of the earlier attacks and the date of the Lake Berryessa stabbing. The attacker later telephoned the Napa County Sheriff's Office from a payphone and reported what he had done. Brian Hartnell survived. Cecilia Shepard died 2 days later. Hartnell was able to describe the attacker's clothing, voice, behavior, and unusual hood. Investigators also recovered impressions from the footwear worn by the assailant. This attack differed from the earlier shootings. The attacker used a knife, wore a costume, communicated at length with the victims, and remained at the scene longer. Differences in method do not necessarily mean a different offender. Criminals can change weapons and behavior. In this case, the writing on the vehicle, the telephone call, and the crossed circle symbol connected the attack to the Zodiac identity. However, the differences have continued to produce debate about whether every officially linked attack was committed by the same person. No credible evidence has established that multiple offenders were involved in the confirmed crimes. The murder of Paul Stine. On October 11, 1969, 29-year-old taxi driver Paul Stine picked up a passenger in San Francisco. The passenger directed Stine to the Presidio Heights neighborhood. At the destination, the passenger shot him in the head with a 9mm handgun. Teenage witnesses observed a man inside or near the taxi and contacted police. A radio broadcast mistakenly described the suspect as a black man. Responding officers may have passed or briefly encountered a white man walking away from the area before the description was corrected. Based on the witnesses' observations, police developed a composite drawing showing a white man with short hair and glasses. Before leaving the taxi, the killer removed part of Paul Stine's blood-stained shirt. Days later, the San Francisco Chronicle received another letter. Inside was a piece of Stine's shirt. That cloth was powerful authentication evidence. It demonstrated that the letter writer had access to something taken directly from the murder scene. The Zodiac also threatened attacks against school children. The threats caused widespread fear, although no school bus attack attributed to the Zodiac ever occurred. Paul Stine's murder was the final killing conclusively linked to the Zodiac through publicly known evidence. The letters continued, but the confirmed murder series ended. What the confirmed record shows, law enforcement officially attributes 5 deaths to the Zodiac: Betty Lou Jensen, David Faraday, Darlene Ferrin, Cecilia Shepard, and Paul Stine. Michael Mageau and Brian Hartnell survived. The Zodiac later claimed as many as 37 victims, but investigators have never verified that number. A killer's claim is not proof. Offenders may exaggerate,
take credit for unrelated crimes, or use public fear to make themselves appear more powerful than they really are. Investigators therefore have to establish a connection through physical evidence, unreleased crime details, eyewitness information, handwriting, telephone calls, or other independent corroboration. That standard is especially important in the Zodiac investigation because the publicity surrounding the case attracted hoaxers, false confessors, and people attempting to attach unrelated murders to the Zodiac name. Possible additional victims. Several unsolved crimes have been proposed as possible Zodiac cases. The 1963 murders of Robert Domingos and Linda Edwards near Santa Barbara have been compared to the later Zodiac attacks because the victims were a young couple in an isolated location. However, those murders have never been officially established as Zodiac crimes. Another frequently discussed case is the 1966 murder of 18-year-old Sherry Jo Bates in Riverside, California. Bates was murdered near the Riverside City College Library. Later communications caused investigators and journalists to consider a possible connection with the Zodiac. The Zodiac eventually claimed that the Riverside crime was part of his activity, but his claim was never independently proved. In a significant later development, Riverside police identified the person who wrote at least one set of letters that had helped fuel the Zodiac theory. DNA analysis of a stamp and subsequent interviews led to a man who admitted writing the letters as an attention-seeking teenager. Police determined that he was neither Bates's killer nor the Zodiac. Riverside police continue to investigate Sherry Jo Bates's murder as a separate case and have said they will not directly participate in the Zodiac investigation, although they will cooperate with the agencies handling it. The Bates case demonstrates why investigators cannot treat every mysterious letter as genuine. A letter may be written by the killer, a person with inside information, a copycat, or someone seeking attention.
The physical and forensic evidence. The Zodiac investigation produced a large amount of evidence, but much of it has serious limitations. Investigators collected cartridge cases, bullets, footwear impressions, handwriting samples, fingerprints or partial prints, and numerous letters and envelopes. The Paul Stein shirt fragments remain among the strongest pieces of authentication evidence because portions were mailed with Zodiac communications. The letters may also contain biological material from stamps or sealed envelope flaps. However, the correspondence was handled during an era when no one understood modern DNA contamination. The letters passed through postal facilities, newspaper offices, police departments, and forensic laboratories. They may have been touched by reporters, editors, postal employees, investigators, and laboratory personnel. Investigators have attempted to recover DNA, but publicly reported testing has produced limited or inconclusive results. Even when biological material is found, examiners must determine whether it came from the letter writer or from an innocent person who handled the item. A genetic profile has little value if its source cannot be established. The same problem applies to fingerprints. A print on a letter, taxi, or other object is not automatically the killer's print. Investigators must prove that it was deposited during the crime and not by a victim, witness, employee, or responding officer. According to recent reporting, the available DNA and fingerprint evidence remains too limited to identify the Zodiac with certainty. The 340 cipher breakthrough. One of the most important recent breakthroughs involved the 340-character cipher mailed to the San Francisco Chronicle in November 1969. For 51 years, the message resisted accepted solutions. In December 2020, codebreakers David Orenchak, Sam Blake, and Jarl Van Eyck submitted a solution to the FBI. Their work combined computer-assisted analysis with the recognition that the message used both substitution and an unusual transposition pattern. The FBI confirmed that the solution was valid. The decoded message mocked investigators, denied that the Zodiac had been the caller on a television program, and repeated his claims about not fearing execution because of his imagined afterlife. But the message did not reveal his name. The successful solution was important because it demonstrated that the cipher contained a genuine, structured message rather than meaningless symbols.
It also confirmed the value of modern computing and international collaboration. However, it did not identify the killer. 2. Much shorter Zodiac codes, including the 13-symbol message introduced with the words, "My name is," still have no generally accepted solution. Because those messages are so short, many different proposed answers can be forced to fit them. A convincing solution must be reproducible and must work without first selecting a preferred suspect. Arthur Lee Allen. The most famous Zodiac suspect is Arthur Lee Allen, a Vallejo man who died in 1992. Allen remains important because he was the only suspect publicly named by investigators. Police interviewed him and executed search warrants involving his property. Supporters of the Allen theory point to his location, statements attributed to him, his interest in codes, his ownership of a Zodiac brand watch displaying a crossed circle logo, and other circumstantial details. In 1991, survivor Michael Mageau selected Allen's photograph from a lineup. However, the identification came more than 20 years after the shooting and must be considered alongside Mageau's limited opportunity to observe the attacker. Other evidence did not establish Allen as the killer. His known handwriting was not conclusively matched to the Zodiac letters. Reported fingerprint comparisons did not connect him to authenticated crime evidence. A partial DNA result reported in 2002 did not match Allen, but later accounts described that testing as inconclusive because the biological material could not be proved to have come from the Zodiac. Allen was never charged with a Zodiac crime and denied being the killer. A 2024 documentary renewed public attention on Allen. Members of the Seawater family, who knew him when they were children, alleged that he had made incriminating statements and that they had traveled with him near locations associated with other unsolved murders. Those accounts or allegations were made many decades after the events. They have not resulted in an official declaration that Allen was the Zodiac. The correct conclusion is not that Allen was innocent or guilty. The correct conclusion is that investigators developed significant suspicion but never obtained enough reliable evidence to arrest or prosecute him. Gary Francis Post. In 2021, an independent group known as the Casebreakers announced that it believed Gary Francis Post was the Zodiac. The group cited photographs, alleged physical similarities, Post-reported history, and its interpretations of the Zodiac correspondence and ciphers. Post had died in 2018 and was therefore unable to answer the allegations. The FBI responded by stating that its investigation remained open and unsolved. No law enforcement agency announced that Post had been identified through fingerprints, DNA, ballistics, or another conclusive forensic method. The Post theory remains an independent claim, not an official resolution of the case. Similarity to a composite sketch is not an identification. A proposed name hidden through anagrams or selective removal of letters is also not reliable proof unless the method produces a unique, reproducible result without working backward from the suspect's name. No publicly released evidence has established Post as the Zodiac Killer. The most recent public theory. A theory receiving attention in late 2025 and 2026 was advanced by independent researcher Alex Baber. Baber named Marvin Margolis and proposed that the same person committed both the Zodiac crimes and the 1947 murder of Elizabeth Short, known as the Black Dahlia case. The theory involves interpretations of codes, artwork, aliases, and circumstances from Margolis's life. Some retired investigators have expressed support for parts of the research. However, neither the San Francisco Police Department nor the Los Angeles Police Department has officially adopted the theory. Experts have also warned about confirmation bias and the major behavioral differences between the Zodiac attacks and the Black Dahlia murder. At present, there is no publicly confirmed DNA, fingerprint, ballistic, or other direct forensic evidence establishing Margolis as the Zodiac. It is therefore accurate to call this the most recent, widely reported theory. It is not accurate to call it a solution. Was there one Zodiac or several? Another theory proposes that more than one person was involved, that one person committed some attacks while another wrote some of the letters. There is no conclusive evidence proving a team or multiple killers. The confirmed cases contain variations in weapons, locations, and behavior, but variation alone does not establish multiple offenders. The strongest argument for a single offender is the authenticated communication. The letter writer knew details of the early attacks, and the person who mailed portions of Paul Stein's shirt was directly connected to that murder. It is possible that some later letters were hoaxes. Investigators have questioned the authenticity of certain communications, and the Riverside investigation proved that at least some attention-seeking letters were written by people unconnected to the murders. That does not erase the authenticated Zodiac correspondence. It means every letter must be judged individually. The FBI has said the most defensible conclusion is that a single offender is officially linked to the 4 confirmed attacks, while some additional letters and claimed crimes remain disputed. Where the investigation stands today. As of July 2026, the Zodiac Killer has not been officially identified. No one has been charged with the 5 confirmed murders. The FBI did not originally have primary jurisdiction because the killings were local and state crimes. Its role has been to assist local agencies with cryptanalysis, fingerprint examination, handwriting analysis, and other forensic services. The relevant local law enforcement agencies retain the underlying homicide investigations and physical evidence. The FBI has repeatedly described the case as open and unsolved. Recent reporting has not revealed an official change in that status. The difficulty is no longer a lack of suspects. Investigators have received thousands of names. The difficulty is finding evidence that can reliably identify one person while excluding everyone else. What could finally solve the case? The strongest possibility would be the recovery of a sufficiently complete DNA profile from authenticated Zodiac evidence. Forensic genetic genealogy could then potentially identify biological relatives and lead investigators toward a family line. But genealogy cannot solve the case unless the original DNA sample is reliable. Investigators would first need to establish that the genetic material came from the Zodiac and not from someone who handled the evidence. A second possibility would be a usable fingerprint or palm print that could be definitively established as the killer's and compared against modern databases. A third possibility would be newly discovered physical evidence. For example, a remaining section of Paul Stein's shirt, a firearm that could be connected through ballistics, original correspondence, or property retained by the offender. A credible confession could also be important, but a confession by itself would not be enough. It would have to contain accurate, unreleased information that only the killer or an investigator could know. The final answer may come from technology. It may also come from a combination of traditional investigation, preserved evidence, and information that has been hidden inside a family or private collection for decades. To conclude, the Zodiac case has endured because it contains nearly every element associated with a legendary mystery. Isolated attacks, surviving witnesses, coded messages, threats, composite sketches, and a killer who appeared to disappear. But behind that mystery were real people. Betty Lou Jensen and David Faraday were teenagers. Darlene Ferrin was a young mother. Cecilia Shepard was a college student. Paul Stein was working as a taxi driver. Michael Mageau and Brian Hartnell survived attacks that remained part of their lives long after the public moved on to the next headline. The Zodiac attempted to make the story about himself, his name, his symbol, his ciphers, and his imagined intelligence. A responsible investigation must keep returning the focus to the victims and the evidence. Arthur Lee Allen was investigated but never charged. The allegations involving Gary Francis Post have not been officially verified. The recent Marvin Margolis theory has not been accepted by law enforcement. The additional victims claimed by the Zodiac have not been proved, and the solved 340 cipher did not contain his identity. The case remains open because suspicion is not proof. Resemblance is not identification, and a theory, no matter how compelling, is not a solution until it can survive forensic examination. After more than half a century, the Zodiac's identity remains unknown. but the evidence still exists. Technology continues to improve, and as other cold cases have demonstrated, the passage of time does not always prevent the truth from finally emerging. I'm Alan Key, and this has been Cold Cases with Alan Key. For more stories about history's most haunting unsolved murders and the science that could help solve them today, my book, Cold Cases: The Most Infamous Unsolved Murders and the Science That Could Solve Them Today, is available now on Amazon. Please subscribe to the channel, share this episode, and join me next time as we examine another cold case from an investigator's perspective. Until then, remember, behind every cold case is a victim. Behind every unanswered question is a family still waiting for answers. And no matter how many years have passed, the truth still matters.